Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Blue Values Journey podcast, where Professor Rose Boswell talks us through various aspects of the Blue Values Journey project. I'm David, your host, and this episode is on the topic of storytelling. We'll jump straight in with Rose discussing why storytelling is so important to the Blue Values Journey project.
Storytelling, I think, is central to the lives of most people. I'm quite fascinated by the stories that we also tell about ourselves, that we all have individual stories and we engage with the world through the stories that we tell about ourselves. In anthropology, storytelling is really important because it is about confirming the membership of particular individuals in a particular society, in a community rather. So it's about sociality, it's about bringing people together. It's about distinguishing who are the masters in the society, who have profound knowledge of nature and have knowledge of the world, maybe beyond the community. So stories are really important in the discipline because it allows also for people who are outside of that community to access the social and cultural world of the people who are within. So we, as anthropologists, we often ask our research participants or people who are in the community, we ask them to tell us a story about their lives or about the community. And that's where the ethnographic richness of our accounts basically come from. So in that sense, storytelling is really, really important. I think the second thing I want to mention up front, and also to help us connect with the role of the body in this oceanic space, is that storytelling is an embodied process. Often what one finds is that in a cultural setting that people will develop particular mannerisms, ways of using their hands when they speak, or there will be certain gestures that they make, and depending on the kind of story that they tell, there will be particular emotional expressions that are also evident on their face. And so storytelling is also a profoundly embodied experience. It's a physically expressive performance and experience. And because it's an exchange process, because there's the storyteller and there's the listener, you will often find, and I've written about this before in respect of the Southwest Indian Ocean region, you will find that there's a kind of a sensory exchange that also takes place between the listener and the storyteller. So if the storyteller is in a position of power, maybe that individual will not be as physically engaged in the storytelling as somebody who is deemed to be on par, to be on the same social level. I certainly found that in my own field work many years ago, that because I was from the islands, there was a way of drawing you, especially into stories of oppression and violence and trauma and so on, in a way that I'd not seen being expressed in the writings of other anthropologists who had come to those islands before, but were in a position of power. Certainly, storytelling is a sensory experience. It's an embodied experience. It's an exchange between individuals, and storytelling is a critical part of the Blue Values journey. We've certainly identified that as being key to the Blue Values Journey project. Just to recap, the project makes use of what we have identified as social scientists to be these master storytellers that come from indigenous and coastal communities. And they tell these stories of their particular history with the ocean, their relationship with nature, and how it is that nature, in a way, tells its own stories back to them.
The stories that you collect, how deeply do you analyze them? And do you ever present the analyses to stakeholders in a way that sheds light on a situation for them and for the community that you're collecting the stories from?
Because the research process is a multi-layered process, the research team and I would have photographs of the research participants or interviewees. There is film, there's video, because we want to be able to go back home and then sit and watch the whole interview process again, because we want to look at levels of the different kinds of responses that are given and to compare the data. And then you have the face-to-face between the individual researcher and the research participant or the interviewee, the community member. Once that data is collected in the raw transcription, we will take that material back to our research, the equivalent of our research lab, our desks, and we will go through the story, pick up particular elements which are quite prominent in the story, the main storyline, and then we will also look for subtexts. We will look for particular inflections, and that's where the audio recording of the interviews come into play, because you can't capture that necessarily in a written transcript. It might not be there, so you do need to listen to the audio again to see whether there's an element of sarcasm, or what emotions are basically being expressed, whether there are stories being told within stories. Sometimes the storyteller will approach the issue from a personal position. So if they're telling a story of colonial rule, they will not talk about themselves specifically. They might describe an event that happened that was disregarded by those in power, and then explain what the cultural consequences were for local communities. The idea that stories basically shape human lives, stories that we certainly heard in Namibia among the Ovahimba, that I had spoken in a previous episode about the role of the holy fire and how the chief up in the northern part of Mbesatyn basically told us the story of how it is that he is the ritual elder in the community, and he's the one that brings those who need healing to the holy fire, what the holy fire means, and who should safeguard it. So there are practical stories that are told. There are stories that have a moral basis that are told, and then also stories that tell of particular historical changes over time.
You've mentioned master storytellers. You've mentioned people with some status in their community. What about young people or children? Do you focus on their stories?
So our project is mainly focused on people who are adults, 18 years and older, because there is a particular ethical prescription in that regard. If you wish to do research with minors, there's a whole different set of ethical applications that are required because of the fact that they are not majors in the society. But we do also work with young people. In the case of Namibia in particular, we are hoping, we haven't yet done this, but we are hoping to work, I spoke about Sister Namibia, we're hoping to work with young women and to hear of their particular stories of nature and of their accounts of being an indigenous person, either inland or at the coast in the country. And we're hoping to tie those storytelling research episodes together with a potential future Blue Journey in Namibia.
Rose, you've heard many stories, you've thought about them and written about them a lot in your work. Could you talk a bit about features of storytelling that have stood out to you in the context of the Blue Values Journey project?
So in Africa, we can see that we have many storytellers. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that communities are in many instances, fairly remote. People live in areas where perhaps even today, the access to telecommunications is low. There is a huge emphasis on the role of the family in basically informing sort of moral behavior within the community and in providing information about how to be a good person in society. Storytelling in Africa is vital and is very much linked to cultural heritage because it allows an individual and their family also to remember the past, especially in a context where perhaps there isn't what we call the vernacularization of knowledge in the form of printed books and media that can be shared both within the community and beyond. So orality or storytelling is a way for communities to remember certain aspects of the past. Remember that the story is also not something that is static. So elements of the story can be added to or improved as time goes on. Certain aspects of the story may be forgotten. Storytelling in Africa is critical to cultural heritage because, first of all, you have the cultural specialists. These are the griots, for example, in West Africa, and other storytellers. I'm thinking of Madagascar, where I have done previous work, and certainly among the indigenous San chiefs in Namibia. We saw this in Tsumeb and Sinsabis when we sat with people who could be deemed to be key research participants. We were often directed to the chiefs, who would then tell us stories of the past, which we're still transcribing because these stories are so rich and so very, very detailed. So the elders are there to basically be the transmitters of this cultural heritage knowledge. The community is there to basically take in these stories, to ask questions about how things were before, and for people to also reflect on their current circumstance. Because in Tsumeb and Sinsibus, that's certainly what we found, is that because of the storytelling of how things were before, the Haikom peoples, the San descendants, they were able to then tell us, well, now things are really bad because we can no longer hunt in certain parts of the land where we currently situated. We do not have a traditional homeland or a conservancy like many other San peoples in Namibia have. So they're able to reflect also on their present circumstance and what is needed in the community and in the society today. The other thing, of course, is that storytelling is a memory device. I said it. Yeah, I remember now. I remember that I mentioned memory device. Yeah, which is very ironic. But yes, you get the point that I'm trying to make. But certainly context. The context is also very, very important. So among the Himba, I mentioned earlier on the holy fire, but again, in the northern part of Namibia, sitting around a fire with all the community members there, maybe there might be some form of singing, there might be prayer. When we were in Namibia in August of 2023, there was a series of supermoons. So sitting under the massive supermoon, which in itself is deemed to be a very powerful force that has an impact on animals and human well-being and all of that, to sit with the moon and under the stars and to have that story also creates a very enigmatic kind of space to receive the stories of the past.
When someone tells you a story about a person entering the sea and spending a month in the sea and then returning, how do you deal with such stories that really challenge the imagination, challenge your reason? How do you go about processing that information or responding to the participant? Can you remain neutral and objective when you hear something like that?
Well, a major aspect of the discipline of anthropology, and this is why the storytelling is so vital to our training and our formation, is that in the first instance, we are trained and required to not be ethnocentric, not to perceive reality and the world from our own cultural standpoint or our own socialization. This is very important because we need to understand cultural diversity in all its contexts. That doesn't mean that we are not, as Nancy Shepherd Hughes, an anthropologist from the United States, said way back in 1995, that we don't prioritize the ethical, because of course there are stories that cross particular ethical boundaries or that pose particular ethical challenges. And so in a way, one has to make a value judgment about, where one sits in relation to particularly troubling or ethically, morally problematic stories. I have quite a few of those from the fieldwork life, which I've published on before. But to get back to the point around how do we deal with things like this, it's also a recognition, I suppose I can quote Shakespeare, that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy, right? From Hamlet. What that tells us is that we live in a world that we're still learning about, that we live in a world that is very, very complex. Every day there is new information about where we can find novel antibiotics, for example. The work of the Rhodes colleagues, Rosie Dorrington, and them around novel antibiotics being found among particular kinds of marine species on the seabed. We didn't have that information 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so we are always learning new things, whether it's from the ocean, whether it's in terms of spirituality, whether it is in terms of the nature of the human body, the complexity of the human body and the complexity of the human mind, the mutability of societies. And so anthropologists are trained and acquire this knowledge incrementally, that the world is massively diverse. And it's very, very important not to put any kind of cultural boundaries or analytical boundaries or spiritual boundaries on the kind of social phenomena that we encounter. Of course, it does help that we travel. I always refer to the work of, I think we pronounce it Ibn Battuta, who basically says that traveling, it provides you with opportunities to learn things and then it leaves you speechless Because when you travel, you encounter such phenomenal social and cultural diversity, different physical atmosphere that you have to get used to. And in the olden days, anthropologists used to refer to that as culture shock. So going to Namibia, it's like the desert heat. It's something that you just do not expect at all. Your body has to seriously adjust to the heat. Or whether it was, as we were talking about in a previous episode, getting into seriously cold water in the middle of winter in the Outeniqua Mountains. So there's a physical adaptation that you have to do. And along with that physical adaptation comes the cognitive and the analytical adaptation. I think it's what makes anthropology such a difficult, but at the same time, such a massively enriching subject, because you have to literally involve every single sense of the human body when you're out in the field. And the storytelling is just one element. And that storytelling itself is such a multi-level, multi-sensory form of human expression.
You must have encountered clashing stories, the historically oppressed, marginalized people, and then the stories that respond to their stories from the colonial people. Is that true? Have you experienced conflicting stories?
In Swakopmund, you will hear stories, and in Lüderitz, certainly, you will hear stories of German colonial history in Namibia and about the food and how the people were buchters in Lüderitz. They hung together, they're Bay people. Whereas when you talk to the Nama descendants, not very far from Lüderitz, places like Keetmanshoop, they will tell you the story of persecution under the apartheid regime and how they were forced across the South African border into southern Namibia and had to fend for themselves. And why today in southern Namibia, there are a number of towns that are named after biblical towns of the Exodus in the Bible. The Nama people that were forcibly relocated or had to move across the border into Namibia, that they saw themselves as a people of Exodus. So there are the stories of the German colonial life and the settling into Lüderitz, into the land of the brave. Those stories of the coast basically clash with stories of the experience of exile and exodus into Namibia. And so just to summarize on that one, when you think about people's relationships with the sea, you can even add another layer, which is the story of the colonial impact on indigenous peoples. Like Shark Island, for example, in southern Namibia, is associated with a story of political oppression and torture of indigenous Ova-Herero people. Whereas that story of Shark Island doesn't feature at all, or very rarely, in any story that you might hear, for example, from German people in Namibia. You may not hear the story because it's not a good story to tell.